Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of Liberty Driven. Really great you've joined me again. I'm really excited about today's episode. I'm looking forward to talking about this article that um, I found by Professor Jeff Frynn-Paul in The Spectator. He wrote this last month. It was published last month. And I had the opportunity to interview Professor Frynn-Paul a couple weeks ago. And I've been working on getting that interview edited together and up. There was some technical difficulties, so sorry about not having this up last week. But it's such a great article and a great interview that I have with Professor Frynn-Paul. This is an important topic, and we covered this topic and a wide range of other topics in our discussion. And really interesting to see his perspective and his insight, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. It's an exciting interview. I had a lot of fun talking with the professor, and I think it was a mutually beneficial discussion. Of course, before we get started, as always, if you haven't had a chance, go over onto YouTube and hit that subscribe button and hit the bell, like the videos, and of course join us over on Facebook, facebook.com/Liberty Driven Books. Like, follow, share us there. I am also on ThinkSpot and MeWe, and my social media presence is expanding as much as I can. So hopefully I'll have these episodes available on all your favorite social media sites. Anyway, without further ado, I really want to jump into this interview. As I say, it's a great interview, really interesting topics that we discuss, and yeah, let's hit that intro and get on with the interview. Well, Professor Jeff, thanks for coming on and talking to me about this article that you've got.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I was really fascinated by it. I read this a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of things stood out to me. So for my viewers, can you kind of summarize what your argument here is in the article?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a number of different layers, but I mean, the basic idea is that I think everybody's been going overboard with the idea that the United States can be seen as primarily based on, stealing land from the American Indians and primarily based on slavery. Those are the two big things everyone's saying. And while, of course, that's true, I think that there's a lot of other aspects to history that everybody's been sorely neglecting. And so in this article, I took on the idea that the United States was sitting on stolen ground, and Canada as well. The Canadians are also all having practically a cultural civil war over this. And so I argue that, while you can say the land is stolen in a few specific contexts, that generally speaking, the argument that it's stolen ground tends to portray European interaction with the New World in a completely negative light. And I'm just arguing once again for balance, the way we used to have for decades, really. I think a lot of my opponents now are trying to argue that every European interaction with Native Americans was murderous, it was genocidal, it was, basically monstrous. Europeans were uniquely bad. And I'm just pointing out the simple historical facts that really isn't true in very many ways. In lots of ways, of course, there were always many factors that were out of people's control, especially in the pre-industrial era. Europeans could barely feed themselves half the time. So to imagine that they were beyond, the control of nature, of demography, of disease, of economic forces, like a lot of people pretend today from their comfy sofas where they criticize history without knowing anything about it. I'm just pointing out to them that these things that they want to believe right now, because the zeitgeist points in this direction, um, there's a lot of other mitigating factors they have to take into account. That's the main argument of the article in a nutshell. So I'm really coming from a point of view of economic history. I'm saying there was especially economic, biological, kind of structural, mechanical, physical forces, not just cultural ones in play. And a lot of my critics don't know the first thing basically about economics or economic history. And so they'll all come from a sort of cultural history standpoint and miss the fact that 80% of my argument is coming from this more economic perspective. So I then go on and argue that, you look past the economic parts of these interactions, and I can go into those as you ask me about them in a minute. But I also say that even if you look at the very early interactions between settlers, including Columbus and Pocahontas and the Massachusetts settlers, there was a lot more give and take, a lot more goodwill than anybody these days is willing to give people credit for. That's basically the article in a nutshell. But I do connect it to the modern day and say, hey, we have to remember that the stories we tell about our democracy are really important on a geopolitical scale with American soft and hard power today. And if we go too far overboard and say too negative of a story about the United States, this really discredits democracy for the entire world. So I'm saying that, yeah, the history is wrong, but they also have to watch out what they're wishing for today.
So it's also in addition to being a historical argument, it's a practical argument.
Absolutely. Because I mean, in
I,
Canada today, people before they say sing the national anthem, they're making a statement of guilt for stealing Indian land every morning before they even say the national anthem. I mean, that to me, that's really affecting our culture and not necessarily in a positive way.
I read this section. Let me read this section in the article that I think is on point, and I think it's one of the sections that really grabbed me.
Yeah.
So it says, what can be the harm on acknowledging every morning that Canadians live on stolen First Nations land? The problem is this: if you begin the day by acknowledging that your country, your society, and the people of your ancestry are particularly egregious, this is a sure route to self-doubt, impotence, and societal failure. What's true at the personal level is true at the national. What well-meaning liberals do not seem to realize these days is that democracies thrive or fail on the basis of national stories.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about this idea of a national story that you elicit or that you referred to here.
Well, I mean, I study and I teach, a number of things, but I'm involved in an international studies program right now, and I teach kind of global history over the last 100 years. And to me, one of the foundational stories of the last 100 years, why the globe has become so much more better of a place for almost everybody, is basically because the Americans and the British won World War II and helped spread democracy to as much of the world as they did, and then acted as a bulwark against communism. And frankly, I think that a lot of people these days don't realize how delicate that balancing act was, how close it could have been, and how much of a threat there still is from non-democratic forces around the world. And of course, we've seen the resurgence led by China and Russia in the last 20 years. And I think everybody's kind of, fiddling while Rome burns. They're all happy to pull down statues and start setting buildings on fire, basically just because they're a bunch of bored college kids, in my opinion. But they're willing to do that and don't realize that there are serious threats, that if the United States, not just our hard power, which everyone takes for granted, but if our soft power is not there, if everybody thinks the United States is uniquely bad, it was a slaving country, even though, of course, almost every country in the world also was a slaving country. If people don't realize how important the United States and its allies have been to maintaining not only democracy but economic opportunity for everyone around the world for the last 100 years, they're really losing sight of why their lives are so good, why they have it so good right now. And again, if you tell these stories that the United States and Canada are fundamentally illegitimate, then you you just weaken global support for the entire democratic project. And to me, that is a fundamental problem that most people in the first world, so-called, just they take far too much for granted.
And it also, goes back to, like, your interest in history kind of mirrors my own interest in history, and looking at history as being far more nuanced and
Yeah,
less
well,
black and
that's just
white.
it. Yeah, guess what? Life is complicated. It's really as simple as that.
Yeah. Um, one of the things that I see a lot is the push to frame all of history in this dichotomy between, or this fight between oppressor and oppressed. That there's
Yeah,
always an oppressor class and there's always an oppressed class. Does
yeah.
your study kind of address that?
Well, you know what? The funny thing is, it's a fairly long article for this kind of article, but I didn't have enough time to go into what I mean by cultural Marxism. And that's really what we're getting at here. To me, I think the left right now, not even just the far left, but the mainstream left, is embracing this new idea that, yeah, the world is just between oppressor and oppressed. It's always a struggle. And to me, the reason why I could label it cultural Marxism is not only because I know for a fact that in the academy there's been Marxists all along, and they really have jumped from the old class struggle model and they've now adopted it as a race and gender struggle model. So, I mean, in the academy there really is cultural Marxism, but I think in the culture writ large, the main symptoms of it are people who don't believe in the democratic process. They don't believe in conversation. They don't believe in the use of reason, being able to reason things out with their fellow citizens. And I'm afraid that, these originally Marxist ideas, Marx basically, comes out of the 19th century in Germany when nobody was listening to anybody. The noble classes were not listening. They were willing to shoot people instead of talking to them. And Marx didn't realize that the British Constitution was a long-term affair that had been slowly making things right through democratic forces for hundreds of years. And he didn't see that in the 20th century, most of the problems that Marx had in the 19th century, that people had in the 19th century, were going to be solved by peaceful democratic means. And the British American model really is the model, for this entire idea. So I think that I can use the term cultural Marxism because I think that anybody now who's infected with the idea that conversation and talking things out, working through normal democratic processes does not work, if they think they need to be violent instead of talking, especially in a functioning democracy like ours still is, then what are they? They're anti-democratic. And to me, that I can call that Marxist because that's fundamentally what Marx and Marxism was all about. It believed in a class struggle. It believed that this was inevitable, and it did not believe that Parliament could solve these problems. And so the left has unwittingly, I think most people don't realize this. They think that protesting in the streets, what they're doing is actually, pushing democracy in the right direction. But newsflash, we actually live in a democracy. If you start using violence and randomly throwing stuff, you're actually damaging the democracy more than you're helping it. People on both sides of the aisle say, get out and vote. I mean, if you don't like things, change it the way that you're supposed to. Change it the way that you have a right and a privilege to do in our society. Otherwise, go try living in a dictatorship for a year, see how you like it.
So it sounds to me like when you're talking about cultural Marxism, you're talking about the preference for violence over dialogue,
Yeah.
and a kind of a, a subtle cynicism.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And it emanates from the universities, from far left professors that are a little too bitter, that don't really realize that their actions have real world meaning. I'm afraid that social media has enabled a small clique of far left professors to get their ideas to a much larger audience, and the effect has not been good. I mean, even Noam Chomsky signed this letter in the Atlantic, and he was
Mm-hmm.
always like saying both political parties were far too right wing, et cetera. But I think even now Chomsky's realizing, gee, we need free speech. We need to be able to think about things in terms of dialogue in a more centrist sort of way.
I recall. This is kind of a personal note. My dad used to tell me that he once had a college professor who lamented the day because he kind of saw this happening back in the 50s. He kind of saw the direction that things might go, and
Yeah,
he worried that one day we would be so divided that you wouldn't be able to hold a ping pong club together.
yeah,
And it
yeah.
seems to be that way. Like, seems to be like politics invades everything.
Bowling Alone, right? Putnam's book on that chronicled the demise of the kind of social club, the local social club. I mean, of course, there used to be partisan social clubs too. There was the Democrats Club and the Republicans Club. But no, people used to hang out more with their neighbors. And again, maybe the social media, the online medium has made it way easier for people to find echo chambers. I think now on social media, you hear the same things from your friends and people get outraged and they don't see the other side physically standing there, and it's easier for them to become unhinged.
Yeah, yeah. We don't hear what the other side is saying because we can choose to isolate ourselves from the other side, and so we
Yeah,
only ever see a caricature.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I'm kind of guilty of that myself. For a while, I got rid of all my conservative friends on Facebook, but then my liberal friends started going so overboard with the identity politics stuff that I started alienating them as well. I don't have a tribe left in the center, I feel, you know.
That's interesting. And it's interesting because you said the term cultural Marxism is a term that I often hear coming from people who are more on the right wing.
Yeah.
And so it's
I'm
interesting to hear you say that, and so I kind of want to hear your view on why that's kind of more favored by the right wing and not so much talked about by the left.
Yeah. Well, I think again, the left thinks that the far right can do wrong, but that the far left can't do any wrong. And I mean, this is a talking point that needs to be brought more to the center. I think what we're seeing now with the anarchy in Portland, that's just pure hooliganism. It's a minor form of terrorism. And so people on the left have to acknowledge the left can go too far. And to me, if they're not talking in a democratic fashion, that's too far. So I'm willing to use the term cultural Marxism and bring it more into the mainstream also because, I mean, a lot of these academics who are that far to the left, who really don't believe in democracy, they need to be called out for what they are as well. So it's not just the popular side of things, but also the academic side of things. It's not everybody in the universities, but there's enough, especially again in the so-called liberal arts. And I think it's time for a reckoning. I think, as long as they were just a small group of ivory tower professors, then, in some ways, so be it. If that's what they want to teach, they can teach it. But if they now have such a huge reach, I mean, I was mauled on Twitter after I put this article out just for calling for a centrist point of view. If some of these professors can have 10,000, 20,000 followers and they tweet it, their 10,000 followers tweeted out to their 10,000 followers, well, pretty soon I had a couple 100,000 people angry at me, a lot of times for an article they hadn't even read.
Yeah.
So that kind of reach now, in other words, needs to be called out. And they need to get back into, they need to be brought back into the folds of civilization, I think. They need to be able to have a conversation with people without slinging mud and calling names and pretending that somehow a quote revolution or whatever it is they secretly want would be a good thing when they know it wouldn't be. I mean, I think it's disingenuous as well.
Now, I had a question for you because you're over in the Netherlands. You teach in
Yeah.
the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Do you see a difference in academia over there versus academia in the States?
Yeah, well, it's a dirty little secret that Europe is very divided into small little tribes. Everybody speaks their own language, and so the French and the Germans, before World War One, they were really world leading, and so they're used to being the major cultures on the planet. But after the war, Europeans have they've been split up. They've been relatively small compared to the Anglosphere because, of course, the United States and Britain kind of work in tandem because they have a shared language. So the long and short is European universities tend to be influenced more by the Anglo-American model than people might think, especially now that digitalization has happened in all the sciences, especially the hard sciences. You have to write in English now. Everybody does, no matter where you are. And to me, as an historian, it's funny because up until 1900, all the universities around the world wrote in Latin anyway. And then they briefly tried to do their own national language. But you realize that speaking to tiny groups of 20 or 30 million people, your science isn't going to get out there. It really has to be in a language every scientist can read. So basically, these days, a lot of European universities are trying to adopt English as their research language. Even in Germany and France, where there's a lot of resistance, they're starting to move towards that model. But what that means is they're importing a lot of the Anglo-American university model as well. And so we are getting, maybe with a 5-year delay, similar cultural effects in our universities here than you have in the States. And to me right now, because it's moving so far to the left, where you basically can't talk about any identity issues at all, especially if you happen to look like I do, without being in danger of losing your job. And it's not as bad as in the States, but it's getting there. They're talking about having these meetings. They're talking about having these meetings where you do bias training. To me, that sounds kind of like a sort of Maoist, meeting where you're told that you're not doing the culturally proper thing. I mean, that's pretty weird stuff.
I would imagine that some of that's a little bit less pronounced because of the more or less demographically homogenous population of Europe,
Yeah,
as opposed to the
I
US.
think so. I mean, and in some ways you can see they're a little more racially insensitive. I mean, as a standard American, I come over to Europe and I think, oh, geez, you guys are being a little more racist than I'm used to in the States. They have lower standards. They can tell a little more off-color jokes and that kind of thing that in the States has been taboo for 20 years and probably mostly for good reason. I mean, you want to make sure everybody's comfortable. But yeah, Europeans haven't had to deal with an influx of minorities till the last few years, really. And for me, it's good. Their culture is breaking up a little bit. It's moving to the 21st century. It's welcoming more people. It can be a little stifling over here. So in many ways, that it's good to have a bit of progress. We take the American melting pot for granted. I think the left is taking it for granted. But the right maybe takes it for granted too. There's a lot of positive benefits to having the kind of melting pot society that we've traditionally had in the States, not least of which is our entrepreneurialism. We just welcome all ideas from all over the place, and we're happy no matter who says the idea. If it's a good one, we take it. Whereas in Europe, if you're not totally fluent in the language in Europe, you're always kind of an outsider. Whereas in the United States, if you're a business person, you have a great idea, you have a bit of an accent, no one cares. As long as you're going to make money, we love it. So I mean, there's a lot to be celebrated about the American model that way. And that's why I'm so sad.
That you put it that way.
Yeah. You have to live here a while before you see those differences. I've lived in Europe for a while now.
How long have you lived in Europe?
Oh gosh, I've been living here about the better part of a decade now. So, and I've lived here various times. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay. So
Yeah,
I'm sorry if I talk over you.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think that the influx of culture in America has been a great strength, and it's one of the reasons that we are kind of a robust culture, that we do
Yeah,
accept all these inputs. Um, that's kind of being given a negative a paint job
yeah.
with the use of the term cultural appropriation. Is that something that's present or talked about much over there?
Well, I mean, again, another aspect of Marxism, academic Marxism, and I think it's been taken over by what I'll call cultural Marxists as well, is what some people have called a hermeneutics of suspicion. They basically read everything negatively. So everything that used to be considered good, they now read bad. And that's just what Marxism has done for 100 years. It's kind of its main methodology. And there's some positive things to that. Marxism for many decades helped us see a new side to things that nobody had ever thought of before. And fine, fair enough. There was a lot of fertile ideas coming out of that. But this cultural appropriation thing, to me, I think most of the things that are now called cultural appropriation um, were usually done out of respect. Like I remember as a kid dressing up as a quote Indian. I remember at some point Madonna was dressing as an Indian person from India, and everyone's starting now to freak out about that kind of thing. And to me, it says we're doing this because we respect you. So you have to take these things as individual acts, and to just blatantly call them all cultural appropriation is another one of these cynical readings that is such an easy thing for quote Marxism to do, or Marxist influenced people to do. But for the most part, it's just BS where people are just trying to create a conflict because it furthers their agenda or makes them feel powerful or gets them more likes on their tweet. I think we need to move beyond that as a culture, and just be more mature about it and accept it. A lot of times it's homage, even they say a lot of times satire is a great form of flattery. And I mean, even if it was satire, not always is that going to be negative. But I would argue most cultural appropriation in many of these contexts isn't even satire. It's just, yeah, it's just saying, wow, I want to be like this person. I think that's a cool culture.
So I want to kind of circle back on something we had talked about a little bit earlier,
Sure.
more closely related to your article.
Yeah.
This idea that um, when we view history, we have to kind of view it with that lens that I guess life kind of sucked for everybody.
Yeah.
And that I think
Yep.
that's something that in our modern kind of cushy Western
Yeah.
perspective, we lose that understanding that the actions taken weren't taken by a, the top dog in the world destroying the underdog. It was
Yeah.
one group of people who was barely trying to survive. And yeah, they maybe took advantage of a group that was less advanced and less capable of withstanding, but they did it from a position of personal survival.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you look at a lot of Irish and Scottish settlers who come into eastern Pennsylvania in the 18th century, and by the time many of them came over in the later half of the middle part of the century, the land had already been taken in a previous generation or two from the Indians, let's say. So if you're a Scottish settler who decides to emigrate to Pennsylvania in 1760, you emigrate somewhere north of Philly where the land was stolen by the walking purchase. Is that is that Scottish person now stealing the lands? You know what I mean? They're starving in Scotland. Somebody gives them enough money, their family gives them enough money and says, "Go for goodness sake, go get a farm." And they emigrate. They barely make it to Philadelphia. They have a couple loaves of bread and a shirt on their back, and they go up and they scratch a farm out of the woods. They haven't stolen the land themselves from any Native American, but they're taking advantage of a system that had been opened up for them, and then they become prosperous on their own hard work. Um, who are we to judge those people? Who are we to say that they've done something wrong? And that's not even to mention the Moravians intentionally giving schooling to many Native American children and assisting them with not only giving them food and education, but shelter as well. And that kind of thing just happens all across the frontier whenever we have encounters. In Connecticut, they set up praying Indian villages in the 1630s and 40s. And the whole purpose was to get the local natives to build houses so that they would stop raiding farms, so that the settlers would stop wanting to start wars with them. Now, eventually, there was a war started for various other reasons. But those praying Indian villages were a good faith attempt to, yes, convert the Indians to Christianity, which is another topic we can get to. I don't blame 17th century people for that really at all, and neither should we. But to try to settle them down, to give them land, to give them houses, to teach them how to farm, by 17th century standards, that was literally about as generous as you could possibly be, those praying Indian villages. And you see that basically all across the early frontier. It's complex.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see a lot of people who come to America and they spend their first good period of time just trying to figure out how to have, those basic necessities of shelter and food and all that kind of stuff. And so providing
and a lot of
that
times,
to...
Yeah, and they're indentured sometimes, so they completely have to work for somebody else as a servant for 7 or 8 years before they can start earning their own money.
Now, your article and everything is kind of geared towards this discussion of Native Americans and this skewed historical view that we have. Do you see it applied in other areas? In particular, I'm thinking about the way that we frame discussions of gender in America and I think around the world, about it being the oppressive males, dominating females. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much going on now when you turn this to a gender issue. I mean, okay, so in general, I mean, women have to contend with the fact that, as soon as they were 15, they were generally having kids, until the pill was invented in the 1960s. That's pretty much what's going to happen. And then in the United States in particular, people, women in the second wave of feminism were very Eurocentric. They only knew European history, so they projected this patriarchy idea back on Europe and said that every man living before 1960 was basically bad in all sorts of ways. But what they don't really remember is that in the rest of the world outside of Western Europe, generally speaking, women had it far worse. And still to this day, in India, there's the gang rape problem. In Egypt, women can't go out in public without being harassed. In China and Japan, there's far more higher levels of sexism. And even in Eastern Europe, that culture is that much more, quote, sexist. If you look at the Gender Inequality Index put out by the UN, the places with the most gender equality on earth are basically the former Protestant countries, for various reasons, of Western Europe and their major colonies like the United States and Canada and Australia. So again, people need to put all these things into perspective and realize that Western Europe really was the culture in the world where feminism began. It certainly was given a huge boost by the Enlightenment, but by the late Middle Ages, European women already had more power of attorney, more power to own property than in most cultures. They were sometimes educated by their husbands and fathers to a very high level. And women got the vote first in Anglo-Western European culture in 1920. And so this whole idea of the patriarchy being a uniform thing, the idea that there hasn't been progress, to me, I kind of call BS on that. I mean, I've had some colleagues who are quote, this new breed of feminists, and they were willing, right in a conference room where I was there, to ignore the last 100 years of gender progress, which to me brought women from a pretty subservient position in the United States and Europe. They couldn't vote, etc. To, approaching equality. Hillary had a good shot of being president. Um, and they ignore all this progress and will still say to me, there's always been a war between the sexes and there always will be. And to me, that says you really don't believe in compromise and you really don't believe in democracy, do you? So I think that is another aspect where people who just want to cause a fight right now, basically because it gives them a little sense of frisson or political power, are ignoring a lot of the realities of history, and they're ignoring that there are many places in the world today where we need to work on giving women fundamental rights that they absolutely do have in Western Europe and the United States. The real struggle should be in places like Eastern Europe, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. That's where women need to be focusing. Feminists need to be.
Even looking at, the position of women 100 years ago or 150 years ago when they didn't have the vote, I'm not convinced that it was necessarily an oppressive maneuver as a recognition of the structure of society. I think there was some discussion about basically the idea being we don't want to have we don't want to give one household 2 votes. Because what about those households that only have the 1 vote? The single man is because then the married man, wife is probably going to follow along with what the man's says about politics, and so it's unfair to give the women the vote when it's just basically doubling the vote of this one household.
And I mean, now a good feminist today will probably say, oh, that's just a rationalization of trying to maintain patriarchal structures or whatever. But I would actually point out to them that in the United Kingdom, working class men did not get the vote until 1920. So in English society, the idea was you would get a vote, and John Locke wrote about this in the 17th and 18th centuries, turn of the century, that only men with property and education should have a vote because they're the only ones who are qualified to vote. And in the United Kingdom, they believed that right up to 1920, that if you were a low educated person with a low status job, that you didn't even deserve a vote. So the fact that women got the vote at the same time as working class men, and in the United States, I'll point out that Black males got the vote 50 years before British working class males did. So before white men in Britain, before all of them got the vote, America allowed its Black male citizens to vote. And that says to me, calling this some kind of patriarchal conspiracy, there's just so many obvious flaws in what should be the logic there, according to that theory.
And I know from reading American history that the argument for a lot of the founding fathers regarding, because voting isn't really discussed in the Constitution itself, it was something that was left to the states. And the argument in the states, a lot of it was the reason we're only going to give the vote to landed men was because only if you own land do you have a real stake in what happens in America. If you don't have land, you could be transient. You could be going from one place to another. You don't really have a care for the long-term health of Virginia or, Massachusetts or whatever.
Yeah. So I think Locke made some kind of argument that if you own land, that you were more rational. It showed that you were a good steward of society, and that kind of qualified you. Now, obviously, you can argue that that's an easy argument for him to make. But I think you're right. The idea was you're a stakeholder in society. And if you have that stake, then you deserve to have a say. Just like owners of a corporation today. They don't give a vote to anybody off the street, who buys a few shares. You have to be a real stakeholder. So that's originally how the thinking was. to me, it's just incredibly remarkable that we moved towards universal suffrage in only 200 years. By historical standards, that's pretty fast, and it's quite a radical experiment. I think most people would agree that it's actually been very effective.
I think America itself is well, you know, the idea of representative government is a pretty radical shift in how things were prior.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. To anything that's existed before. And I mean, again, that's another lesson that I think I've learned from a deep study of global history is just how fragile democracy is, how the default in the world is autocracy and dictatorship. And if you screw up those delicate democratic institutions, things quickly fall back into some kind of autocratic situation. I think actually one of the big lessons that Gulf War II, that the people planning that war didn't think about or didn't realize, no matter how many smart people were involved in the 2003 invasion, they didn't realize that a country is not naturally democratic, it's naturally autocratic. And I think they thought that if you release the bonds of the dictator, that everything's going to go back to its natural democracy. Well, I think the American and British experiments show that you have to very carefully build democratic institutions over decades, in most cases, in order to get a populace who's ready to receive them, willing to receive them, and governing officials who are ready to take on that stewardship without trying to basically screw everything up and corrupt those institutions.
So talking about this dismantling of systems of order, and democracy not being the default, that representative government not being the default. That's kind of what we see in the Soviet Union when the and it was autocratic before, and they dismantled that system, and it wasn't replaced with democracy or representative government. It was replaced with more autocracy.
Yeah, sadly, and I think you're right. That's a great example of that. Everybody assumed, I think Fukuyama assumed, and the whole diplomatic corps in 1990, that now Russia was free to move towards the democratic capitalism that everybody knows and wants is the best thing, to be the best thing. But Russia had, however many years of communism it was. And then before that, they had the most absolutist government in all of Europe. The Tsars gave their people almost no rights. They were all serfs until the 1870s. So no wonder Russia lapses back into autocracy, and it may well take decades before the good influence of democracy, if we can keep it together, will spill over into Russia. And I think eventually it will, because capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. And they produce good things, including not just hard power, but soft power. And so I think eventually people will gravitate towards it, but we just have to keep it going long enough for that to happen. That's our job.
It's interesting that, these systems that we cherish and that we think are great aren't natural conditions, and they do have to be maintained and kept going.
Yeah.
Or else we slip back down to despotism.
You see that every time. You see that with the Romans, with the Florentines, with the French and their revolution. I mean, the Germans, and unless it has a really strong basis, it can go south pretty quick.
And that kind of circles back to your earlier comments about the danger of these riots and these pushes for revolution, because you get that and you don't know what it's going to look like at the end.
Well, see, that's just it. That's been the biggest problem with the far left through the 20th century, is they say, oh, true communism has never been tried. We're going to go for a revolution, and then it'll all work out just fine in the end. And then somebody says, well, what's your actual plan? What's your business plan going to look like? And they say, oh, I don't know, we'll figure it out. The problem is, as you saw in the Russian Revolution, as soon as you have a revolution where there's a small group of intellectuals who think they know better than everybody else and they're going to try to create the right system. Well, what if society votes you out? The Russian revolutionaries knew that if they had an election, they'd be voted out because they were only 5 or 10%. They were pretty radical. They were going to abolish property. Nobody wants that. So the problem is these people will necessarily be a minority, a tiny one. And in order to safeguard their power, they can't hold a general election. That right there should be a red flag. You know, how are you going to create some new system where you have 5% of the people telling everybody else what they should be doing? So it's fundamentally flawed, and it's a absolute recipe for a dictatorship, and it's just so fundamentally clear that anybody who knows how these things worked and has studied the patterns.
I kind of see the same way. I see a lot of conservative people saying, well, we need to have a, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Levin. He's a popular
little bit.
talk radio
Yeah.
guy. He keeps on talking about needing to have a constitutional convention to propose new amendments to correct, you know, corruption and problem and flaws.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem I have with that is the original constitutional convention was a very touch and go operation, and to get the right mix of personalities and beliefs to create a system that is not worse than what we have is not likely.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. Anytime you say, all right, we're just going to, you know, take the gloves off and we're not going to bar any holds, we're going to send a bunch of groups in and hope that they hash out a good constitution. As you say, the odds that that's actually going to work are not very high. I mean, look what happened to the French. They were trying to imitate the American Revolution. The problem is in France, there was a nobility and there was a powerful church, and there were neighboring nobilities in neighboring countries. They all meddled in France's convention. And even if the people originally there did want to have, you know, a just, truly constitutional government come out of it, there were a lot of parties who did not want that. And they ended up becoming powerful enough that all heck broke loose. You know, and I think the same thing could easily happen if we try to do something that rash now. There's a reason the British haven't done anything like that for the last 800 years. And to me, they still have one of the best functioning democracies on the planet. You know, so the long-term view says, you know, work out your problems no matter how frustrated you are right now. You know, whether you're on the right or the left.
Yeah, tread lightly when you tread on history.
Yeah, and when you tread on those institutions, if you have some of the best institutions in the world creating the most wealth of any country, the most happiness still, despite what everybody's trying to say on social media, and you know, we won't even go into the you know, Sam Harris's numbers on actual police shootings and how relatively low and modest they are, despite what everyone tries to exaggerate. I'm not saying there aren't problems, but it's easy to exaggerate all this stuff. There's a lot of good things to celebrate about the United States. And I think right now, people have the message basically backwards.
Yeah. I want to bring up one last thing. Could you talk about how your article is written with this economic perspective, and with everything we've been talking about with the fragility of representative government, the fragility of the institutions and systems that we have in place. What's your view when we see these pushes to tear down the capitalist system?
Yeah, that's actually a good thing to seg to, because again, the people calling for the tear down of democracy, I think maybe even before that, they want to tear down capitalism. So I think that's maybe even their primary goal.
And as you said, you know, the two kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, well, see, that's, again, when I did my doctoral dissertation, I was looking at the so-called, the Marxist roots of capitalism. And I was trying to say, okay, Marx, if you think that capitalism was a system that had a definite beginning and that it could be uprooted and torn down, let's see where these origins really are. And the conclusion I came to after years of research was that there is no such thing as a capitalist system. There is supply and demand, and there is relative degrees of freedom in regulating supply, demand, and markets. Markets are basically where supply and demand come together. And so you have to regulate markets to some degree. It's a question of how much. And most totalitarian governments try to limit markets and people who sell in them. So they try to limit business people, basically too much. And then in democracies, we allow people to put whatever idea, crazy idea they can come up with, if it's some kind of funny spinner that your kids get all excited about, and you can make millions off of that. So any idea you can come up with, you can mass produce and you can sell. And so to me, there is no such thing as capitalism. When you look at Marxist economics, they tried to do without markets for about 5 years, and then they had to reintroduce currency, they had to reintroduce banking, they had wages. Basically, Eastern European economies were also far more market oriented than anyone realizes. So even there, they couldn't get around the basics of supply and demand. And so this idea of tearing down, quote, capitalism, yes, you can maybe limit the power of multinational corporations, sure, but that's not a fixed part of capitalism. That's something that can be regulated if people are that worried about it. But to come up with a notion that you're going to tear down capitalism itself, you also look at where capitalism evolved. It evolved in Florence, Genoa, and the Dutch Republic, and in England. Those are the most democratic countries on earth. The reason why capitalism evolved is because there was already democratic countries there that gave people the freedom to do what they wanted to produce things for the market and make a profit personally. And so from the get-go, democracy and capitalism have evolved hand in hand. Capitalism thrives in places where there is freedom, where there is strong rule of law, and yet freedom from fear, freedom from corruption. And places like China are never going to be able to compete with the United States as long as they stay totalitarian, because all the capital is going to flee to the democratic countries where they know it's not going to be arbitrarily confiscated. So democracies have also had a great track record of safeguarding private property and capital and giving you an incentive to try to make more. So when you look at all these historical things binding capitalism and democracy together, in the end, I say, if you're anti-capitalism, you're basically anti-democracy. And people need to get that message out. I think people on the right need to get that message out a lot more than even they realize.
What I find is interesting, you talk about you use the phrase, the Marxist roots of capitalism. And to tell you the truth, for a long time, I avoided using the term capitalism because the term capitalism was it was coined by the socialists. It was made popular by Marx, and before that, there was no term for it. It was just markets, and there was the free market, and there was Adam Smith described how these markets function and work, and it was this imposed term that was used to describe a system of oppression that Marx thought was evil and horrible in what he was seeing. But he was mostly more talking about industrialization more than anything. But I do see capitalism as being fundamentally I guess the term at least, being a Marxist invention.
Yeah, I mean, as a pejorative term, it absolutely is a Marxist invention, I would say. As a useful term to describe modern economics, I mean, it's useful in some ways, but historians have now divided it into various stages. We have like pre-capitalism, we have financial capitalism in the 18th century, which is basically the development of modern banks and finance. And then there's industrial capitalism and post-industrial capitalism, all these various things. So I mean, it's a useful term, but you're absolutely right as a pejorative one. It doesn't mean what almost any person who's trying to criticize it thinks that it does. They basically have a bad idea. And even Adam Smith, it took us a long time to figure out what markets actually were. It wasn't really till the later 19th century that we even knew how to draw a supply and demand graph. So discussing the natural economy has only been something we've been able to do really since Keynes, since the 1930s. But it's always been there, and so to call it capitalism in that pejorative way, it far oversimplifies everything.
Because ultimately, what we're talking about when we talk about markets, what we're really talking about is, the market is no more than human beings interacting with each other, free from coercion.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what democracy is.
Exactly. Yeah. And so for me, I don't go as far as being a libertarian because I see that markets always have to have legal props, for example, to prevent monopolies from occurring in a lot of markets. But I still say that, yeah, they're healthiest, generally speaking, when they're freest.
I'm having a wonderful time having this conversation, but I'm kind of running out of
Yeah,
questions. I'm running a little bit dry.
yeah. No, I think you really helped me elucidate a lot of the side issues that are swirling around the culture now when people read my article, and they're thinking about a lot of these things, but it's all just kind of a big mess, and a lot of people are just so influenced by social media, and nobody really knows what to think about them these days. So that's where I think more of my colleagues, professional historians who know some of these details anyway, need to get more scientific stories out to the public. People are hungry for this stuff. People can understand it. The public's far smarter than anyone, on social media seems to think. And that's what the founding fathers really were all about. They actually trusted the public,
Yeah.
ultimately. Even if Madison, says he didn't trust them in various ways. Ultimately they were willing to do so. And I think we have to do that today. But getting scientific information out there is key to people making good decisions.
I think it was Jefferson who said, people cannot be ignorant and free in a state of civilization. Something along those lines. That's the essence of the quote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And I
don't
think
remember.
it's about educating people.
Yeah, exactly. And that was a big part of the whole Enlightenment project, which again, we haven't gotten to talk about too much here, but that's really the fundamental thing that we're all talking about is preserving the Enlightenment project, which at first maybe was about all white men are created equal, but it very quickly, everyone realized it's about everyone being equal, all people being equal. Yeah, no, that's the greatest strength of our system is that it has been moving pretty inexorably towards greater equality for almost everyone. And really up to about 5 or 10 years ago, we pretty much had it cinched. We had about as much public equality as people could really ask for. And it was moving in a private way in the right direction as well. So that Enlightenment project shouldn't be criticized too much because it's the basis of all that really the left holds dear. And I feel like they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater when they criticize the Enlightenment and 18th century founding fathers. Those are the people that gave them the foundation of everything that they're fighting for.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And you may not be aware. I wrote a book on the history of liberty and its
I've seen
connection
it
with.
and I'm intrigued about it. I was looking at it earlier.
So my idea is basically that even back then, even back in the 70s,
Yeah.
they did have a concept that when they said all men are created equal, all people were created equal. I think they really did believe that. I just don't think that they had a good framework or social structure to know how to apply that principle.
To bring it about yet. If you look in the Federalist Papers, there's several places where they're saying black people, women are equal to everybody else. They all have souls. They're all on the same playing field. But you're right. I think they realized that the fragile alliance between the North and the South at that point. There was no way you were going to free slaves and be able to free yourself from England at the same time. It would have been a civil war, and it would have been a failure. So you have to allow for reality. A lot of the founding fathers knew that slaves were going to be freed eventually. It just couldn't happen then, or the whole project would have died. So they had to do what they could at the time, and a lot of their hearts and minds were in the right place, I would say. And people need to hear
that's
that
a big,
message.
yeah, that's a big part of what at least the first half of the book is about establishing
Yeah,
that fact that they did
yeah,
have a really good understanding of what
yeah.
liberty meant.
What liberty and equality means.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's one of the best messages I think that needs to get out. So yeah, so thanks for writing that. I'll certainly look into your message more and spread it around.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Hmm.
Well, I think I'm out of questions.
Yeah, well, thanks. I think you said
I
it was going to
appreciate
be
your
about an
time.
hour. So
Yeah.
yeah, no, I'm quite happy to have a chance to speak with you, and I appreciate the detailed questions that you're asking.
Thank
It
you.
was fun for me too.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, and I will send you a link when this is up, and
Okay,
let you see it.
super. Okay, thanks so much, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you. So I hope you liked that interview with Professor Frynn-Paul. I know I enjoyed talking with him. It was a fascinating guy, fascinating discussion. As I mentioned in my interview, and as I mentioned every episode, make sure you head over to libertydriven.com and grab your copy of The Liberty Driven Revolution. Help us to get this message out. As Professor Frynn-Paul says, this is an important message. It needs to get out there. It needs to be more in the public discourse, the truth of our American history, the truth of our heritage of liberty, to fight the cultural Marxism as he was talking about, to fight these destructive forces in our nation, and hopefully preserve the values and benefits of our society. So again, yeah, if you haven't had an opportunity, again, go over to YouTube and subscribe, hit the bell notification, and of course, head over to facebook.com/Liberty Driven Books and follow us on Facebook. Again, if there's a social media platform out there, I'm probably on it. I'm on MeWe, I'm on ThinkSpot, I'm on a bunch of others. Haven't got Twitter going yet, but that might be coming here in the short term future. So thanks again for joining me, and I hope you guys enjoyed the interview, and I will see you guys next time.